Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast, and we are continuing on our high performance HR series. So last week we talked about how we as individuals can set ourselves up for success, and this week we're going to think about how can we target that success and make it measurable. So it's linking in the sort of interactions and the areas of HR that we can have an impact on, and looking at how we can make that HR impact measurable. So we'll touch on things, all the different aspects of data that are potentially available to us in HR. We'll talk about the balanced scorecard, which is a podcast episode I did years ago actually, but it was very popular, and I've also got associated video content, so go to, if you want to see something as opposed to just listen to something, do go to our YouTube channel. So I've got some little explainers called Actus Insights, and that gives you examples of the balanced scorecard, and we'll look at things like engagement surveys, pulse surveys, employee net promoter scores, those sort of things. So essentially it's about looking at how we can discard the soft and fluffy suggestion, which I realise is not true, but the way in which HR can sometimes be seen as a soft function, and we can choose the right data methods of gathering data and data areas of metrics that will help demonstrate business value. Now, why you might want to do that? Well, we want to demonstrate business value to make what we're doing quantitative, to make it more science-based, to give us credibility at the table and to show how we align with the overall business requirements. So we'll touch how the balanced scorecard can align HR strategy with business goals. So I'll give you some real examples of that. We'll look at other HR data points that I've mentioned around surveys, but also other foundational metrics that we can use to measure success. And those sort of data points might sit within a balanced scorecard. We'll touch on AI, because I think you can't not at the moment, how that should be incorporated in it, and just ultimately try and make it as practical as possible, maybe give you some inspiration as to how you can confidently identify the right criteria or metrics that you could use within your role that's appropriate to your organisation or industry that help you to drive measurable HR impact. So fundamentally, let's start off. I talked about the balanced scorecard before. Let's give you a little bit of understanding about it in case you are not familiar with it. And as I say, I've got lots of content on this if you'd like to know more about it. I remember using the balanced scorecard within the organisation I worked with some years ago, and we had an overall balanced scorecard, and we adapted that for HR and learning and development, and it was really powerful. It was a really useful way of doing it. So if you're not sure what the balanced scorecard is, it's something that is used for strategic performance management, essentially. And the argument was it was originally developed by Robert Kaplan and David Norton in the 1990s. And it's essentially a framework that aligns business activities with strategic objectives. So they'd identified that too many businesses were just looking at financial success. So the classic balanced scorecard, the classic balance sheet, your profit and loss account. But of course, the problem with that is that the numbers that are on your profit and loss account, your balance sheet, really only are the output of what the activities were that you'd done last year and the year before that. Okay, so they are just showing the impact of last year's efforts. So they basically said that what you need to do is think about how you can take something like that that's looking at last year, which is a lagging indicator, and basically define the leading indicators, the idea being that leading indicators are the sorts of activities that you can do now that will affect next year's financial results, because after all, we can't do anything about last year, and what we all want to be doing is driving future success. So by doing that, they divided this balanced scorecard into 4. And they look at metrics from a financial point of view, which, yes, is measuring last year's efforts. That's your lagging indicator. But they also look at it from a customer perspective, from an internal business process perspective, and from a learning and growth, sometimes called organisational capacity perspective. And actually, if you looked at an overall balanced scorecard, you would probably see that HR activities fit into a little bit about internal business processes. So whether we're thinking about recruitment or performance management processes, those sort of things, or very much about organisational capacity, which is very much where HR might sit in, looking at how we are developing people, have we got the right skills. Organisational capacity can also be resources. If you're in a manufacturing area, maybe it's machinery or tools to do the job as well. But the idea is that balanced scorecard is more of a holistic approach of strategic execution, helping you to do things more broadly, and it's going to lead to more sustainable success. And I've given you some examples of those as I go through it, but what I will do now is just nip into some examples that I've got around how you might build an HR balanced scorecard if you wanted to, or a learning and development one. And as I said, if you want to look at those online, I've done it in a video as well. But before I do that, one of the things that I didn't know, and I only actually discovered this relatively recently, is about how the balanced scorecard actually flows together. So people don't always realise this. And this is useful for us from an HR perspective, because as I said earlier, quite often organisational capacity or learning and growth, that's a lot of it is about the people. It's about our people stuff. Now, what the scorecard is actually saying is that they all flow into each other. So if you want to ultimately impact financial performance, you need to start with learning capacity. And the reason I think this is quite valuable for us to be aware of is that, the power in most of the organisations that we work in sits with the FD, in terms of they control the purse strings. But helping them realise that by investing in organisational capacity, which could be employee training, IT systems, developing leadership and management skills, culture, that is all about investing in organisational capability. And without the right people with the right skills, you're not going to positively affect the next one, which is your internal processes. Because a well-trained workforce with efficient systems is going to improve operational efficiency, innovation and decision making. So your processes are dependent really on the people who are driving the processes. So it all starts with organisational capacity, which basically says that if you're in HR or learning and development or OD, you're at the foundation of driving financial success if we follow this flow through the balanced scorecard. And too few people recognise that. They do not see the link. So this is a really great business language way of showing a link between investing in people activities, ultimately linking to financial results. Not always next year, but in the future, as opposed to it's something that if you cut it, it may not. So then if you think about things like internal processes, better operational, smoother, more streamlined processes. Now, those may well be, if you're an order intake process, they're not always going to be sitting within the HR remit. So you might have customer service processes, complaint resolution processes. You may have processes for manufacturing or for compliance or for making sure that you are building a piece of software in a certain way, going through things. So there's loads and loads of processes. But the main point is within an organisation is the more streamlined and well delivered those processes are, the more effective we're going to be, because we can deliver more for less, or we can improve quality. So processes are a great area, but remember, it all starts with people having the right skills. So it goes skills, then it goes process, and then that's when you get customer satisfaction, because if we're delivering great quality outputs because we have highly efficient processes, then satisfied customers are more likely to make repeat purchases, refer others, increase spending. That's going to improve our brand reputation, customer net promoter scores, so they're more likely to, increases our brand value. And of course, as it goes forward, higher customer satisfaction should increase revenue, makes it easier to retain customers. You don't lose customers as quickly in terms of churn. So all of those are going to lead to increased financial performance. So just being aware of how the balanced scorecard flows and seeing that a lot of what we do in HR is at the core foundational area of leading into then process, customer satisfaction and up to financial outputs, then that's really quite powerful. So let me then try and bring that to life for you with some the sort of things that you might put in a balanced scorecard if you wanted to start to think about one for your organisation. And I would not recommend that you try and measure everything that you can, right? So what I'm going to go through are examples of things that you could measure. What you want to do is pick maybe just a couple of metrics in each of the quadrants at a maximum that you might track, and they need to be relevant to your organisation and your overall strategy or goals. So if we were thinking about an HR balanced scorecard, thinking about the measures that may fit into each of the 4 boxes, and this is not exhaustive, these are just things that spring to mind for me. So in the financial area, I mean, you can have actual figures or numbers around cost of recruitment. So if you're using agencies, it could be about salary or bonus pots. It's a benefits, cost of benefits packages, anything that actually costs money. Equally, it could be retention. You could argue, put something like retention rates in there. Again, that's a sort of flip of not having to recruit. Then you go on to customer. So the customer quadrant in the HR or the learning and development balanced scorecard, I would suggest is your internal customer. So you could look at things like engagement scores. You can have an employee net promoter score, and I'll talk about both of those shortly. So those are the sort of things you might look there in terms of their satisfaction in those areas. But also you might have other survey data that you put in there around whether or not people feel they're getting the opportunities to progress, etc. Are people actually feeling positive about their ability to move or to grow within the organisation? So you could have specific metric areas which I guess would fit with certain questions in your engagement score. So it doesn't have to be an overall engagement score, it could be that you want to progress certain bits of it. If you then think of things like processes, well, there's loads of HR processes, aren't there? That's for sure. Performance management processes, recruitment processes, of onboarding and offboarding, those sort of things, how quickly or how satisfied people are around them. And then finally, learning and growth or resourcing. So you could look at the proportion of a specific type of skill within the organisation. Have you got enough of it, or do you want to increase it? It could be about uptake of training courses, attendance on training courses, numbers of people who are compliant with certain things, whatever it might be. Again, the point is those elements all need to be highly relevant to what your business is trying to achieve. So there's no point in measuring things for measurement's sake. And that can be one of the hardest things to do, because often the things that are easy to measure are not necessarily the things that are going to move the dial so much. So think carefully about what you can measure and what the right things to measure are, so that it really focuses it, because they do sort of say, what gets measured is seen as what matters. So you could just go employee engagement. You could go, actually, what's really important is that we have high quality, we have satisfaction with our performance appraisal process this year, because we know that drives engagement. So you might put something that's very specific to focus people on. So think about what the HR metrics are that are relevant to where your organisation is trying to go this year, and then you can attach those within it and track them. And the idea is you can track them quarterly, probably monthly, quarterly, annually, and you can change them next year. But it's certainly something to think about in terms of making what you do quantifiable. It makes it really focused, because it's very easy for us to be looking in many different directions. The problem with that is our energy is spread in different directions, and it makes it really quite hard for us to measure our impact. Maybe we're a bit too diluted. So this is quite focused and specific and very tangible. So those are areas in which you could look at the balanced scorecard. Now let's think more broadly about the metrics. So the metrics, I'm going to look at metrics in a number of ways. I'm going to look at overall, or the ones I see as overall metrics. So surveys, whether you go engagement, pulse, net promoter score. So explore a little bit about that in case you're not using them, or whether you're considering whether they are effective for you. And then I'd think about foundational metrics that might sit underneath it. So we'll touch on things like recruitment effectiveness, performance and productivity, values and culture, training effectiveness, and HR operational efficiency. So we'll just drill into each of those 5 areas in a little bit more detail, because that might give you food for thought as to what metrics you would want to put within your balanced scorecard and measure overall. So surveys, you've got to start really with surveys. So this is an obvious one to sit within your customer, your internal customer box. But I mean, surveys, well, again, lots of things haven't really changed. When I was in the workplace, we were using Gallup Q12. That is still seen as the gold standard, but it is expensive. You're paying a lot for their researched questions. What you're paying for is the fact that they have consistently demonstrated a link between employee engagement and, you name it, key business outcomes, whether it's productivity, profitability, customer satisfaction, turnover, absenteeism, everything. But do you have to use the Q12? Now, obviously, you can't just rip off the Q12 because that's what you're paying for. And also, you do get some great benchmark data with Gallup Q12, although I'll come back to benchmark data. A lot of it's quite US. It's not, you don't always get it the right size or industry, depending on what your role is. But, in reality, you could build your own 12 engagement questions. There are different ways of wording things. What's the most important thing is, I don't think it's what the questions you ask. What's important is, A, the response rates, because it says quite a lot of people don't bother responding. B, what you do with the responses. So people actually see that you act on them, or you try to find something else out, or you use them to progress things. And C, to make sure that you run the same questions on an ongoing basis to measure progress. So, whatever you're going to ask, if you just ask it and don't do anything with the answer, then you might as well not bother asking. And that's when people get cynical. So whatever you choose, you could choose your own questions. Don't do too many. That's one thing I think people can really overdo. Make sure you follow up on them. And make sure you run them again, for at least a couple of years to see whether you're progressing, because then you can see how things are going over time. Now, one of the things you hear people do more of are things like pulse surveys. And I was wondering, they were quite fashionable. I thought they were really fashionable during COVID. And I think maybe when they're looking at something specific like well-being, that's quite a good way of doing them. So a pulse survey is basically a short, frequent survey with little insights, and supposed to go as you go along. And it's quite useful for people. I think it is something, maybe allows them to act on something, but you want it to be really like 3, 4, 5 questions, not too much of it. And I think people do get a bit fatigued unless they see it as being for a specific purpose. So personally, I think where I would maybe use a pulse survey now might be to assess specific activities. So maybe when somebody's just been onboarded, or they've just finished their probationary review, maybe after performance appraisals, if you want to see how well people or satisfied people are with those, or if there's some element of change as to where things are. So thinking about what's the purpose of that pulse survey. I wouldn't just run them for the sake of it, would be my take on it. And then the final one is something that I haven't used myself, but I've just been researching it because I was interested in it. So I think many of us will have heard of the Net Promoter Score. So a Net Promoter Score is a really good example of something to have in a balanced scorecard, an organisational balanced scorecard, if you measure them. And it's basically an internal Net Promoter Score. So the Net Promoter Score is used to assess customer loyalty. So this is really about employee loyalty, or their likelihood of the people that work for you, how likely they would be to recommend their workplace to others. And how it works, if you're not familiar with it, usually you get asked a sort of straightforward question on a 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this company as a place to work? And if someone says a promoter would be answering a 9 to 10, so they're highly satisfied, they're motivated and enthusiastic. Passive, 7 or 8, which is interesting, you see, because these are quite high scores, I think, in an environment where people maybe are not that engaged at the moment. And then they call a detractor people who are on a 0 to 6. So I suppose that would correlate with disengaged. Now, I'll share some results in the end, which I thought were quite eye-opening. But fundamentally, you take your overall Net Promoter Score is your percentage of promoters take away your percentage of detractors. And I remember doing customer service training years ago, where they sort of said that one dissatisfied person tells 10 other people, whereas one satisfied person tells 1 or 2. So it is an interesting one. It's quite a high bar in many ways to kind of get to these sort of things. But fundamentally, what you're looking for is, if you were to get as an organisation a score above 50, that means you've got a highly satisfied and loyal workforce. How well do you think your workforce would be doing? An interesting one. Well, I can share with you, I did some digging into I know obviously I've got international listeners. I looked at UK because usually a lot of the data points are quite US. I looked into the UK stuff, and I have to say it was quite scary because, and maybe this is again a sign of the times. So the benchmark data is quite limited, but this research I found from Hive, it showed really dramatic differences. But let's put it this way, no one was over 50. So generally the higher scoring ones were or actually should we just say the ones that were positive, so they weren't detractors, just there were more positives than there were detractors, were areas like professional services, telecoms, IT and tech. But then the ones that were coming in minus, so more people really fundamentally fed up, healthcare, education, manufacturing, hospitality and construction. So what do I take from that? Well, I think it says to me that we don't have a great deal of engagement, and you could probably understand that, or Net Promoter Scores, people are not massively satisfied. I thought that was useful to share because you might think, I don't know how well we do, to show that you're not alone. It's not realistic at the moment from what I can see to be getting in the 50s, or you're doing amazingly if you are. But I would look at it as maybe an area where we could have competitive advantage, because if you are in an industry where people are generally fed up, then just those little tweaks where you can make your place better to work than the next place, where you can make sure your line managers are doing a great job better than the next place, that's actually going to be a really great retention tool. So it's while it's a snapshot, the employee NPS, and it's a bit of a blunt instrument because it is very general, as opposed to, at least with the engagement, you can ask more specific questions about, have I got the learning and growth? Have I got career opportunities? Have I had feedback? It's much more behavioural. And of course, the employee engagement survey, almost all of it drills into management effectiveness. When you actually look at it, the way in which you can drive it is through good quality people performance management. Whereas the eNPS, it's a blunt instrument. It's just, would you recommend it or not? And it can be a route for people just to share their disquiet. However, it's still data, and if you're taking it in the right direction, that can be helpful. So we've deep dived into Balanced Scorecard, examples of that, and surveys, which for me, it's almost, if we went uber strategic at the top, your Balanced Scorecard overhangs it all. Survey data is really useful for you to think about where to hone. So obviously you can think about aligning with the business strategy, which is important. So that should be one of your drivers of the Balanced Scorecard. But also the data that you get out of employee surveys is going to give you gap analysis, areas where you can focus on. So then if we went further down in terms of other options for you, in terms of metrics that you could use to measure impact, I would also consider things like recruitment, things that, other areas where you might be able to take things on board. So something like recruitment effectiveness. If you are in an organisation where you need key skills quickly, if you've got high turnover, this could be really important. So getting the right skills and workforce in place efficiently and up to speed. Now, this could fit as one of your process targets if you wanted to, but it could also be skill. It depends in terms of whether you, and actually that's the point to make. It doesn't really matter what quadrant you choose things to go in. Sometimes things could go in either quadrant. You choose. It doesn't matter which one it is. Just go for the one that feels more of a fit. But you could measure things like time to hire and versus industry benchmarks. And I do think the recruitment industry is an area where there is quite a lot of benchmark data. A lot of the big recruiters are quite good at providing that. You could look at the quality of hire. You could see about retention of hire after recruiting it. So thinking about quality might be about people's performance or their skill uptake. And obviously you can measure whether people have stayed or not. Cost per hire, recruitment ROI. So there's quite a lot of metrics that you can get to there. Interestingly, I said touching on AI, I do see that potentially AI is useful in recruitment, and I think it has improved. So I remember the early examples of AI where people were a little bit cynical, saying that it was only recruiting in the shape of what it'd been trained. AI is as good as it's been trained to be, but apparently, now you can get better stuff like around predictive hiring, where you might be able to determine candidate success. These are things you don't have to use them, but you could explore them. Does something correlate with success in your organisation in terms of that? Or could you simplify or speed up hiring using something like AI? So initial CV screening using AI, you can imagine, could be helpful. Writing specific questions, interviewing questions. There's lots of ways in which you could look to smooth it. And I would also think about, brand in terms of recruitment effectiveness. It's just about getting the right people in there, but maybe you could use AI to make sure that people get feedback, or they are at least communicated with if you're not going to take them forwards. And I know some of the ATS platforms are better than others of those, but those sort of things, thinking of the impact of the people you don't bring in place is actually quite key in terms of net promoter, as an external net promoter. So that would be something you could put metrics around. And again, it depends on your organisation, but let's say you're in hospitality, retaining people has got to be really key, or getting the right people in and up to speed really quickly is vital. If you're in an organisation, and this is the high performance series, but it's all about performance and productivity, can you measure performance? And if so, what percentage of those highest performers are you retaining? And are they performing year on year? What percentage are achieving their sales target or gaining bonus? Do you do ratings, and are you doing bell curves and calibrating those bell curves and seeing where people are performing year on year? How effective are your managers? I mean, again, this is all quite circular. The HR stuff becomes circular. I'd argue that managerial effectiveness is probably linked to your engagement score. But again, just thinking about these things in the round. So think about how can you really help people to be productive? What proportion of people have got really clear, smart objectives and they are achieving them? So those things in terms of your processes, in terms of the performance management processes, what number of people are getting feedback and having one-to-ones and check-ins. All of these are little drivers of performance and productivity. Then you might want to think about something like values. So if you're more of a value-driven organisation, how embedded are your values? Or maybe you've launched some new values and you want to see whether they are really brought to life or people are paying lip service. So maybe you're trying to develop the culture of your organisation. So you might put some metrics in around there. So what could you do to measure culture? Again, some of the surveys will always come into this, but maybe it's the questions that you ask. So you could ask values-driven questions and look at where certain areas of your business are particularly high on against certain values, to what degree people perceive the values being role modelled. You can use tools like 360 feedback, where line managers can get a real holistic view of the extent to which they're seen to align with the values. So that can be really, really powerful. And you could include values questions or assessments within your performance management or your recognition tools. So in our Actus system, you can have people can recognise others based on the values, which is a really easy way you can manage. It kind of encourages recognition of values and that sort of nice recognition approach, but it's also quite an easy way of tracking the extent to which certain areas are strong or not. In our 360 tool, you can look across the organisation, you can amalgamate, and you could see that as an organisation, just an example, our managers are getting a score of 4.1 in feedback skills, or whatever the measure might be, that management effectiveness, whatever the question is that we've asked around it, whereas we might target that we want to get them up to a 4.4 for next year. So if you've got the tools that are happening anyway and you're rolling them, then that would be a really great way of measuring them. So cultural and values alignment is another aspect you might want to think about putting in there. in terms of this. And then the other two I thought about would be training effectiveness, really valuable about getting people to have the right skills, making sure people are able to perform in their job. Again, all of these sort of feed up into others. So training effectiveness or training processes might fit into processes. If it's something like compliance training, it could be you do some skills analysis or competence mapping, and you want to fill those gaps, and you want to track how many people have increase their skill in a certain relevant area within your business. You might have a certain technology or something that you need to have more people in your business who are able to handle a certain technology or respond to a certain problem or question. Whatever the gap is in your organization, you need people with those skills. And actually you might recruit for them, but sometimes it's more cost effective or necessary to train them up. So how effectively can you do that? You can do ongoing annual assessments. And again, this could be something where AI, where you've got rolling things that have to be assessed, this is often with compliance. Do you have to make people go through the most boring e-learning every single year? Or could you get AI to predict where people are, or get people to have a pre-skills and knowledge approach, and then just have training or do an e-learning just on the stuff that they need to refresh? So you think about how you can make training effectiveness just more light touch, but get more for your money in many ways in terms of getting helping people to demonstrate they've got the right skills when you need it, but in a less painful way. And then finally, the kind of no-brainer would be operational efficiency for HR. So have you looked at all of the routine tasks? If you're an HR department of one, are there things that could be automated or outsourced without that would basically free you up to be able to look at the more strategic things? And this is a strategic episode. We're looking at things that if you're making a difference around any of these areas and putting them in a balanced scorecard and moving them on, you are making a strategic difference to your organisation. And therefore you need to try and minimise the admin, because that is going to slow you right down. So what other routine tasks could you get someone to either, whether it's employee self-service or get a system to do it for you? I mean, electronic performance management, learning management, they're no-brainers. So you've got the reporting straight away, but presumably you have automated routine tasks like payroll, benefits administration, compliance reporting, those sort of things. And you've streamlined your recruitment process as much as possible. Encouraging individuals, employee self-service to do HR tasks is key, and line managers, and that can be a cultural thing, but those definitely make a difference there. And again, look for where AI, this honestly stuff's coming through, whether it's a chat bot, these things seem to be coming through all the time. So you can use AI for more than just writing your policies through ChatGPT, although that in itself can be helpful and save you time. So I think we've covered quite a lot of content here, and the main thing though I would say is, so we've talked about our balanced scorecard, we've talked about surveys, which gets you data of things you want to improve, we've talked about other metrics that we can use within HR to fit within it. The key point to emphasise is make sure it's relevant to your business, make sure it's something you can measure, and don't boil the ocean. Just pick the top points for you. Make sure that they are actionable points that you can do something about, and make sure you do review and adapt. They need to evolve with business needs, and be prepared to go full circle and go and evaluate it. Don't do it in isolation. Communicate these insights. Make sure that in the board meetings people can see that you are actually being very strategic and driving things forward, and make sure your colleagues understand that this sort of investment and time and energy is all about the base of the balanced scorecard. So if you invest in your people and your resources within your business, that's going to flow into more effective processes, more satisfied customers, and ultimately this is the way in which HR is impacting the balance sheet. It's not a direct impact, it's a slightly indirect impact, but it's a knock-on, and therefore quite powerful, because it can gain momentum, or it could be diluted if people don't get behind it. So do think about that and make sure people understand why. I feel as HR in this sort of area, you've always got to be explaining why you're doing something, so they can see that the key value of it. So I really hope that you found something which is food for thought there. As ever, go to the show notes if you want to see links. Do go to our Actus YouTube channel and follow that if you want to be able to download some of the insights where we've got practical aspects of it. And, if you found this useful, please do take a moment to review or send a message. I'm into my 5th year of doing this and I'm trying to write some fresh content for people. So it would be great to know whether it is helping you or not. Many thanks. See you in 2 weeks.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.